The Grand Conclave Hall was the largest room in the known galaxy, or at least that was what the sovereignty liked to tell everyone who walked through its doors. The ceiling stretched so high that clouds formed near the top of it. The walls were carved from black stone pulled from a dying star. Hundreds of alien delegates sat in curved rows, their voices mixing into a low hum that filled every corner of the chamber. It was a place built to make visitors feel small. That was the whole point. Commander Ilara Voss did not feel small. She stood at the center podium in her gray uniform, her dark hair pulled back, her jaw set like a locked door. Behind her sat the rest of the human delegation, 12 people, each one watching the alien faces around them without flinching. The humans had been called to the conclave for what the High Council was calling a disciplinary review. Everyone in the room knew what that really meant. It was a show. The verdict had been decided long before Ilara walked in. High Counselor Draven Solus sat at the head of the council table. He was tall, pale blue, and ancient, a member of the Veth species who had run the sovereignty for over 300 years. His fingers were long and thin, and they tapped the table slowly as he looked down at Ilara with the kind of expression someone gives a stray animal that has wandered into a clean room. "Commander Voss," he said, his voice smooth and cold, "you stand before this council charged with deliberate disruption of sovereignty operations, unauthorized distribution of classified resource data, and incitement of civil unrest among member states." Ilara did not blink. "I stood before this council 6 months ago and showed them proof that the Inner Circle was stealing food allocations from 7 outer member worlds. I gave them every document, every record, every name." She paused for just a second. Nothing was done. The hall buzzed. Delegates shifted in their seats. A few of the outer world representatives, smaller species from the fringe of sovereignty space, leaned forward slightly, listening. Draven raised one long hand. The hall went quiet. "The council reviewed your claims and found them to be exaggerated and politically motivated. The matter is closed." His eyes stayed flat and cold. "What is not closed is your behavior since that review. You shared that data publicly. You spoke to news networks. You encouraged other species to question sovereignty leadership. That behavior is destabilizing and dangerous." "It is accurate," Ilara said. "It is over," Draven replied. He straightened in his chair and looked at the full chamber. "The council has deliberated on an appropriate response to the actions of Commander Voss, and by extension, the human colonial fleet she represents. Execution was considered." He let that land for a moment. "However, this council is merciful. Instead, the human colonization fleet, all 40,000 registered individuals, is hereby stripped of sovereignty trade rights, communication access, and territorial recognition. They are exiled to the outer rim and forbidden from re-entering sovereignty space without council approval." The hall erupted. Some delegates applauded. Some shouted objections, most just watched. The outer rim was not a place anyone was sent and expected to return from. It was the dead end of the galaxy, a stretch of space beyond the last charted systems, full of radiation fields, broken planets, and the ruins of civilizations that had tried and failed to build something there. The sovereignty used it as a warning. Behave or end up out there. Ilara stood at the podium and said nothing for a long moment. She looked at Draven. She looked at the rest of the council. Then she looked out at the hundreds of alien faces watching her, waiting for her to cry or argue or beg. She did none of those things. "Noted," she said. That was all. She turned, gathered her delegation, and walked out of the Grand Conclave Hall. Senator Velkarath watched her go. He was a tall reptilian delegate from the Keth border worlds, old enough to have seen 3 sovereignty wars and wise enough to know what the face of a dangerous person looked like. He had voted against the exile, not out of love for humans, he barely knew them, but because something in his chest had told him this was a mistake. A large one. He watched Ilara's back disappear through the chamber doors and felt that feeling again, sharp and clear. The council had just given her exactly what they thought would destroy her. He was not sure they understood what they had done. The human fleet was docked in a sovereignty port station on the edge of charted space, 40 ships ranging from massive colony vessels to small escort craft. 40,000 people lived on those ships. Families, engineers, soldiers, doctors, farmers, teachers. They had come to the sovereignty's territory 3 years ago seeking trade agreements and a place to expand. They had gotten corruption, delays, and now this. Ilara walked aboard the flagship, a large colony vessel called the UNSS Defiant, and went straight to the bridge. Her crew was already there, having watched the conclave broadcast live. Nobody spoke when she walked in. They just looked at her. She stood at the front of the bridge and looked at the star map on the main screen. The outer rim glowed at the edge of it in a dull gray color, uncharted, unnamed, unmarked beyond a general warning zone. The rest of the galaxy was lit up in the sovereignty's gold and blue, beautiful and closed to them now. "They think we are going out there to die," she said. Her voice was calm and even. "They think the radiation will kill us, or the pirates will, or the cold, or the hunger." She looked at her crew one by one. They have never had to fight for anything. They were handed their empire by people who came before them. They do not know what people who have nothing left to lose are capable of. Her navigation officer, a young man named Dak, looked at the gray zone on the map. "Commander, the outer rim has no supply lines, no infrastructure, no law." Ilara nodded slowly. "Good, no rules out there." She pulled up the fleet communication channel and opened a broadcast to all 40 ships. Every screen on every vessel lit up with her face. "This is Commander Voss to all fleet personnel. The sovereignty has exiled us to the outer rim. They believe they have sentenced us. What they have actually done is removed every restriction we were operating under." She let that sink in. "We are no longer bound by sovereignty trade law, no longer subject to conclave oversight, no longer required to ask anyone for permission to do anything." She looked directly into the camera. "We are going to the outer rim. We are going to land. We are going to build. And when the galaxy looks out there in 5 years, they will not see a graveyard." She paused once. "They will see us." The channel stayed open for a moment. Then, one by one, responses came in from across the fleet. Not words, just the sound of 40,000 people deciding not to be afraid. The Defiant's engines powered up. The rest of the fleet followed. In a slow, steady formation, the human ships turned away from sovereignty space and pointed themselves toward the gray edge of the star map. Back on the port station observation deck, a cluster of alien dock workers watched the fleet go. One of them, a short, four-armed creature named Brix who had worked the docks for 20 years, shook his head. "Poor things," he said. His colleague, an older Orin with tired eyes, watched the last human ship disappear into the dark. He had lived under the sovereignty his whole life. He had seen what it did to species that stepped out of line. He had also seen, in 30 years of watching ships come and go, a particular kind of look on a crew's face when they departed. Defeated crews looked down. Those humans had not looked down. "I don't think so," the old Orin said quietly and went back to work. The first thing the outer rim taught the humans was that it did not care about them at all. The second thing it taught them was that not caring was different from being unbeatable. The fleet arrived at the edge of charted space after 6 days of travel, and the moment they crossed the last boundary marker, the instruments on every ship started screaming. Radiation levels jumped. The navigation charts went blank because there were no charts out here, only raw sensor data, and whatever the crew could figure out on their own. The stars in this region were old and dim, spread far apart, their light barely reaching across the distance between them. 3 planets within scanner range showed up as dead rocks with poisonous atmospheres. A 4th had no atmosphere at all. Lieutenant Calla Rain, the Defiant's chief science officer, stood at her station and read out numbers in a steady voice. She was young, barely 30. With the kind of focused calm that came from spending too many hours in university labs to be scared of complicated data, Radiation band is wide, but it has a pulse pattern, she said. It's not constant. It rises and falls on a cycle, roughly 9 hours on, 4 hours off. She looked up from her screen. During the off cycle, levels dropped to manageable range. Alara stood at the center of the bridge. Can we shield against the on cycle? Not with what we have now, but if we adjust the hull plating frequencies and reroute power from secondary systems, we can cut exposure by 60% during the high periods. Kala paused. We'd need to run tests. Start the tests, Alara said. That was how it went in those first weeks. Every problem that came up got a person assigned to it and a deadline attached to it. There was no time for despair. The fleet had brought enough food supplies for 4 months. After that, they needed to find their own sources. They had fuel for the ships, but no way to refine more without equipment they didn't have yet. They had doctors and engineers and soldiers and farmers, all of them suddenly doing jobs that overlapped with each other in ways that no textbook had ever planned for. Alara divided the fleet into working groups. Engineers went to work on the radiation problem. Biologists launched survey drones toward every planet and asteroid in scanning range, looking for anything alive or useful. Military personnel set up a perimeter watch rotation because the Rim had pirates, and those pirates would eventually notice that a fleet of 40 ships had just parked in their territory. Everyone else worked on food, water, and shelter planning. On the 12th day, the biologists found something. The 4th planet in the nearest system, the one with no atmosphere, turned out to have an underground cave network that went deep enough to stay warm from geothermal heat. The caves were full of a gray fungal organism that grew in thick mats across the cave walls. Dr. Neem, the fleet's lead xenobiologist, brought back samples and spent 3 days running tests. He was a quiet man who spoke slowly and smiled rarely, and when he came to Alara's briefing room on the 15th day with a small plate of something cooked, she raised an eyebrow. "It's edible?" she asked. "Not only edible," he said. "It has a protein structure that is almost perfectly compatible with human biology. We can grow it in large quantities using the cave heat. With the right cultivation setup, one cave network of this size could feed the entire fleet indefinitely." He set the plate down. "It tastes like slightly bitter bread." Alara picked up a piece and ate it. She chewed slowly. "Start growing it." The food problem was not solved that day. It took another 3 weeks of setting up growing stations and testing batches and adjusting cultivation methods. But from that point on, starvation was no longer a realistic threat. The humans had found their first foothold. The radiation problem took longer, but it was solved too. The engineers, led by a stocky woman named Chief Barrows who communicated mostly in technical shorthand and hand gestures, figured out that the radiation pulses could actually be captured and converted into power. The physics behind it was not complicated once she worked it out. It was essentially a very aggressive form of solar collection. She built the first test collector on the 3rd week, and by the 5th week had enough working units distributed across the fleet to power every ship without burning fuel reserves at all. She presented her results to Alara with a flat expression. "We don't need to worry about fuel anymore as long as we stay in an active radiation band." Alara looked at the data. The Sovereignty spent 20 years telling everyone the Outer Rim was a dead zone. Barrows shrugged. They never tried to live in it. That was the thing about the Rim that the Sovereignty had never understood. The galaxy's powerful species had looked at it from a comfortable distance and called it worthless because it didn't look like what they already had. It didn't have neat trade routes or functioning stations or built infrastructure. It had raw material everywhere, energy, minerals, life forms, and most importantly, ruins. The ruins were discovered by accident. A scout ship following a mineral reading near the edge of the Keth Expanse, a region of dense debris fields about 2 weeks' travel from the fleet's new base, found something buried under layers of rock and dead metal. Structures. Old ones. Not sovereignty, the architecture was completely different, angular and dense, built from a material that scanned as nothing in any database the humans had. The ruins spread across 3 connected asteroid bodies and went deep inside all of them. Ilara took a team of 20 people and went herself. Inside, they found technology. Dormant, cold, some of it collapsed, but unmistakably advanced. Drive systems with geometries that human engineers had never seen. Power cores that were still faintly active after what the geologists estimated was at least 10,000 years. Data storage units in a language no one recognized. Whoever they were, said Ilara's archaeologist, Dr. Solis, walking slowly through a wide corridor and shining her light on the walls. They were here long before the sovereignty existed. Can we understand any of it? Ilara asked. Not yet, but we can study it. We can take samples. We can map everything. Solis ran her hand along the wall and looked at the faint markings on the surface. This is not junk, Commander. This is a library. Back at the fleet's growing settlement, which the crew had started calling Ashfall Base after the gray dust that fell constantly from the cave ceilings, the humans were not alone anymore. 2 species had begun approaching them cautiously. The first were the Drath, a silicon-based species that lived on a cold, rocky planet nearby and were considered primitive by the sovereignty because they had never developed space travel on their own. They communicated through vibrations in the ground and had no verbal language, but they were deeply intelligent and extraordinarily strong. They had been watching the human fleet since its arrival and had finally sent a delegation, 7 tall, gray, stone-like figures who walked into the settlement one morning and stood still in the center of it, clearly waiting. Ilara walked out to meet them alone. The diplomatic process was slow and strange, and involved a lot of trial and error with hand signals, drawn images, and eventually a simple translation program that Dr. Neem built using vibrational patterns. But it worked. The Drath had no interest in politics. What they wanted was simple. The humans had technology the Drath did not have, and the Drath had knowledge of the local terrain, resources, and dangers that the humans desperately needed. It was the cleanest trade in the galaxy. The second group came from further away. The Orin Collective, a scattered people who had once had their own worlds before the sovereignty annexed them and scattered them across the rim as labor workers, had heard through fringe communication channels that a human fleet had arrived and was not dying. A ship of 60 Orin arrived at the edge of scanner range and broadcast a single message on an open channel in broken but understandable common speech. We heard you are building something. We want to help. We have nowhere else to go. Ilara brought them in. By the end of the 3rd month, Ashfall Base had permanent structures, a working food supply, a radiation energy grid that powered the entire settlement, a research team working day and night on the ruins, and a growing community of humans, Drath and Orin working side by side. Back in sovereignty space, an observation drone was finally dispatched to check on the status of the exiled fleet. The Conclave officials who sent it expected to receive images of wreckage, scattered ships, and distress signals. What the drone's camera found instead was a thriving settlement on a previously dead world, 40 ships in stable orbit, energy readings that didn't match any known power source in sovereignty records, and a human child standing outside one of the base structures, looking up at the sky. When the drone's camera locked on, the child noticed it. She tilted her head, squinted at the little machine hovering above her, and then waved at it with her whole arm. The drone recorded everything and sent it back to the conclave. Senator Velkarath received a copy of the footage before the council's morning session and watched it 3 times. The child waving, the clean structures, the energy readings, the Drath and Orin figures moving through the settlement alongside humans. He set the datapad down on his desk and looked out the window at the gold-lit halls of the conclave building. Outside, everything looked exactly as it always had. Neat, controlled, permanent. He did not feel as certain about that last word as he used to. 3 years after the exile, the outer rim looked nothing like it used to. It still had the radiation bands and the dead planets and the long stretches of dark between star systems. The cold and the dust and the ancient silence of a place that the rest of the galaxy had forgotten were all still there. But running through all of that now, like a spine growing inside something that had once been boneless, was structure. Order. A web of routes, agreements, stations, and signals that had not existed before the humans arrived. The sovereignty called it a mess. Everyone who actually lived in the rim called it the best thing that had ever happened to them. Ashfall Base had grown into Ashfall City, a full settlement built across 3 connected cave systems and spreading now onto the surface, protected from radiation by a series of collector shield towers that Barrows and her engineering teams had developed and refined over 18 months. The towers pulled in the radiation, converted it to power, and broadcast a low-frequency dampening field across a wide radius. Standing inside that radius was no different from standing on any normal planet. The shield technology had been so successful that the humans had started licensing it to the Drath and Oran settlements nearby. The Oran had turned out to be extraordinary electronic engineers. Decades of being scattered and underfunded had made them creative with limited tools, and when those limitations were removed and they had access to proper materials and workspace, the things they built were remarkable. Their communication systems were faster and more secure than anything the sovereignty used. Their sensor arrays were sensitive enough to detect a ship powering its engines 3 star systems away. Alara had given them a full research facility and unlimited supply access, and they had paid it back 10 times over. The Drath, meanwhile, had become the most reliable ground force in the rim. They did not carry weapons in the way other species understood weapons. They were the weapons. Their silicon bodies were harder than most armor materials. They could survive in vacuum for short periods, and they hit with the force of a heavy machine. They were also patient, quiet, and completely loyal to the agreements they made. When the Drath gave their word, it stayed given. The Volkai Syndicate had not given their word easily. The Volkai were the Rim's oldest pirate network, a loosely organized collection of about 30 different raiding groups who operated under a shared banner and a shared policy. Take what you want, from anyone weaker than you, because the Rim has no law. They had left the human fleet alone for the first year mostly out of curiosity. By the second year, when Ashfall City had grown large enough to look like a worthwhile target, 3 Volkai raiding groups had come to test it. The first group hit a human supply convoy moving between Ashfall and one of the Drath settlements. They took out 2 escort ships in the initial strike and were preparing to board the convoy's main vessel when the response arrived. 8 human warships came out of a hard burn intercept trajectory and boxed in the raiding group before they had finished their first attack run. The Volkai commander tried to run. He found that the human ships were faster than anything he had in his fleet, and that their targeting systems did not miss. His ships were disabled, not destroyed. His crew was not killed. They were boarded, disarmed, held for 2 days, fed, given medical treatment for anyone who needed it, and then released in escape pods with a message from Commander Voss recorded on every pod's communication unit. The message was simple. The convoy lanes are off limits. We will not explain this again. The second Volkai group hit a Drath settlement on the outer edge of the Compact's territory 3 months later. They found Drath warriors and a human rapid response team already deployed and waiting. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. Nobody died on the human or Drath side. The Volkai group ceased to exist as a functioning unit. The third group came to Ashfall City itself. Or rather, they tried to. They broadcast an aggressive demand for tribute while still 15 minutes out, clearly expecting the kind of frightened scramble that usually happened when they made that move. What they got instead was silence for 2 minutes, and then Alara's voice on their communication channel. You are currently in range of 14 defensive batteries and 9 armed escort vessels, she said. I have your ship configurations on my screen. If you turn around now and go back the way you came, we will not fire. If you continue toward us, we will disable your ships and you will spend the next month as our guests while we decide what to do with you. Choose." The third group turned around. After that, the Volkai Syndicate sent a negotiator. It was a strange and uncomfortable series of meetings. The Volkai had never negotiated anything except the division of stolen goods. But Alara was patient and she was clear, and she offered them something they had not expected: work. Legitimate contracted work running supply routes, salvage operations, and perimeter patrols under the Compact's flag, paid in resources and technology access. For the Volkai groups that accepted, it was a better deal than raiding. Most of them took it. A few didn't and moved to a different part of the Rim. That was acceptable. The Rimward Compact was formally signed on the second anniversary of the fleet's arrival at Ashfall. It was not a long document. It had 7 articles covering mutual defense, trade terms, resource sharing, dispute resolution, and the rights of every species within Compact territory. Every species signed it with their own mark. The Drath pressed their hand into a special ink panel. The Orin signed in their looping written script. The human delegates signed in ink on paper, because that was how humans had always signed things that mattered. Alara signed last. She set the pen down and looked at the room, Drath standing like statues along one wall, Orin clustered in their typical close-grouped way, former Volkai commanders sitting awkwardly in chairs that were not quite the right size for them, a dozen smaller Rim species that had joined in the months, since the word spread that there was a place in the dark that treated everyone fairly. It was not the sovereignty. It did not want to be the sovereignty. The research teams at the Keth Expanse ruins had been making progress for 2 years, and in the 4th month of the 3rd year, Dr. Solis called Alara to the site in the middle of the night shift. When Alara arrived, Solis was standing in the center of the main ruin chamber surrounded by 6 other researchers, all of them looking at a holographic display like people who had just been told something that changed everything. "We cracked the drive geometry," Solis said. Her voice was quiet with the specific kind of quiet that comes when someone is trying not to shout. Alara looked at the display. "What does that mean in practical terms?" The chief physicist, a thin, older man named Dr. Han, pulled up a comparison. On the left was a standard Sovereignty FTL drive schematic, the kind used by every major species in the galaxy. On the right was the geometry taken from the ruins. The difference was not subtle. The Sovereignty design moved through space in a single calculated jump. The ruins design, which the team had started calling the Ashfall Drive, moved through space differently. It folded transit distance in a way that made jump time almost negligible, and more importantly, allowed for precision micro-jumps at ranges the Sovereignty system could not manage. "You can jump inside a combat engagement," Han said. "You can jump away and back in seconds. You can arrive exactly where you intend to arrive even in a moving scenario." He looked at Alara steadily. "No one in the galaxy can do that right now." Alara stood there for a long moment. Outside the ruins, the gray dust of the Keth Expanse settled slowly over everything. "How long to build a working prototype?" she asked. 6 months, Han said. "Maybe 5 if Barrows helps." "Get Barrows," Alara said. The news reached the Sovereignty not through any spy or leaked data, but through simple trade gossip. The Rim was producing things that the Rim should not have been able to produce. Species that the Sovereignty had written off were suddenly thriving. Trade routes that used to run entirely through Conclave-controlled space were being redirected through Compact territory because the Compact's fees were lower, and the security was, according to every merchant who used it, dramatically better. 12 Sovereignty member states had quietly reached out to Ashfall through back channels in the past 8 months. 3 of them had requested observer status in the Compact. They were small states, outer members who had never benefited much from Sovereignty membership, but the fact that they were asking at all was deeply alarming to the Inner Council. The Sovereignty sent a formal delegation. They arrived at HFY Station, a new orbital hub built to receive visiting ships, in a large diplomatic vessel flying the conclave's gold and blue flag. The lead delegate was a tall, smooth-spoken Veth official named Ambassador Reth, who had the polished manner of someone who had never been told no and expected that record to continue. He was escorted to a meeting room aboard the Defiant, which was still the fleet's flagship and still looked like a working warship rather than a diplomatic venue, because Ilara had made that choice on purpose. Reth placed both hands flat on the table and smiled with the careful, measured warmth of someone performing warmth rather than feeling it. "The sovereignty wishes to extend an opportunity," he said. "Given the impressive resilience your people have shown, the Council is prepared to offer a path back into sovereignty fold. Reduced status, naturally, given the circumstances, but full trade rights restored, communication access reinstated." Ilara picked up a datapad from the table and slid it across to him without a word. Reth looked down at it. On the screen was a map. The outer rim, the gray zone, the dead zone, the place of exile, was lit up in green. Lines of compact controlled territory spread across it like a root system. The green area was labeled with population numbers, trade volume data, and member species counts. It was larger than 17 sovereignty member states combined. Reth stared at the map for a long time. His smile did not come back. "We are not coming back," Ilara said, "but we are open to a conversation about what happens next." She folded her hands on the table. "When the Council is ready to have that conversation on honest terms, they know where to find us." She was not rude. She was not angry. She was simply and completely certain in the way that a mountain is certain. Reth left with the datapad. Ilara watched the diplomatic ship depart from the Defiant's observation window and then went back to work. There was still a great deal of it left to do. The High Council met in closed session for 11 hours. No delegates were invited. No record was kept. When it was over, High Councilor Draven Solus walked out of the chamber looking like a man who had made a decision he was confident in, which was how he always looked, because he had never in his long life been forced to question his confidence, and he did not intend to start now. The decision was simple in the way that bad decisions often are: send the fleet. The sovereignty's military forces had not fought a full engagement in over a century. There had been border skirmishes, peacekeeping actions, the occasional suppression of a member world that had gotten too loud about its grievances. Nothing that required the full weight of what the Conclave could project. The Council had maintained that weight anyway. 800 warships split across 4 permanent fleet divisions, not because they expected to use it, but because having it meant no one would challenge them. They were about to use it. Ambassador Reth had delivered his report in careful, diplomatic language, but the meaning underneath the careful language was clear. The humans were not going to fold, they were not going to beg, and the green territory on that map was growing. Something had to be done before more member states started looking at the compact's trade numbers and asking why they were still paying sovereignty fees. The official order called it a stabilization operation. The internal briefing called it something more direct. Every member of the 4 fleet divisions was told the same thing: go to the outer rim, dismantle the human settlement and their allied structures, and return the region to its previous ungoverned status. Take prisoners if it was clean and easy. Do not spend extra time making it clean and easy. 812 warships assembled at the last sovereignty transit point before the rim border. It took 3 weeks to organize. Supplies were loaded, coordinates were locked, commanders were briefed. It was the largest military movement the sovereignty had organized in living memory, and the Council watched it come together with the quiet satisfaction of people who were used to being the biggest thing in the room. They did not know that the orange sensor arrays had detected the fleet assembly on day 1. Ilara received the full report: ship counts, class breakdowns, estimated transit time, projected entry vectors, while sitting at her desk in Ashfall City's command center at 6 in the morning. She read it twice. Then she set it down, drank her coffee, and called a senior staff meeting for 1 hour later. When her commanders, engineers, and allied representatives were seated around the table, she put the numbers on the screen. The room was quiet for a moment. Then her ground forces commander, Major Fenn, a broad-shouldered man who had been a warship captain before the exile and still thought like one, leaned back in his chair and said, 800 ships. And 12, said Ilara. 812, Fenn corrected himself. He looked at the screen. We have 300. 307, said Ilara, and they don't have what we have. She pulled up the HFY drive specifications. The prototypes had been tested for 4 months. They worked better than Han had projected. The micro-jump capability in particular had been refined to a level where the transit time between a targeting lock and the jump execution was less than 2 seconds. In a combat situation, that meant a human ship could be fired upon and be somewhere else before the shot arrived. It also meant a human ship could attack, jump away, and attack again from a completely different vector before the target had time to respond. The Sovereignty fleet had never seen anything like it. They had never needed to account for it. Their entire combat doctrine was built around opponents who stayed in predictable positions and fought with the same basic physics that everyone in the galaxy used. The humans no longer used those physics. We are not going to win by being bigger, Ilara said. We are going to win by being faster and smarter. Every commander in this fleet has had 4 months of HFY drive combat drills. We know exactly how to use this. They have no idea it exists. She looked around the table. We are not destroying their ships. We are not killing their crews. We disable, we disarm, and we demonstrate. Understood? There was a pause. Fenn raised one eyebrow. You want to beat 800 ships and not destroy any of them. I want to beat 800 ships and not destroy any of them, Ilara confirmed. Because how you win matters as much as whether you win. We are not the Sovereignty. The planning took 6 days. Every compact member contributed what they had. The Auran deployed their sensor nets across the entry vectors, creating a detection web that would give the fleet real-time position data on every Sovereignty ship from the moment they crossed the rim boundary. The Drath warriors were assigned to boarding teams. Their role would come after the main engagement, when disabled ships needed to be secured quickly without casualties. Former Volkai pilots, who knew the debris fields and radiation bands of the rim better than anyone alive, were integrated into the human fleet as navigators and flanking specialists. The Sovereignty fleet arrived at the rim boundary on schedule. Their formation was neat and textbook, 4 divisions in a wide approach spread, designed to sweep forward and overwhelm any defensive position with sheer volume. The commanders were experienced. Their ships were well maintained. Their confidence was high. What they found when they crossed the boundary was silence. No defensive line, no human ships in visible range, empty space and the dim light of old stars. The Sovereignty Fleet's senior commander, Fleet Admiral Sova, ordered a forward advance and began pushing toward HFY City's last known coordinates. His sensors were showing clean, no contacts, no energy signatures in the immediate area. He assumed the humans had scattered or fled deeper into the rim. He was wrong on both counts. The engagement began when the Sovereignty Fleet was fully committed to the advance, spread across a wide formation that had extended itself to sweep a broad search area. That was when the humans appeared on every Sovereignty sensor simultaneously, already inside the formation's perimeter, already in firing positions. The first wave of attacks targeted propulsion systems on the outer division ships, precise shots, calculated to disable rather than destroy. Before the targeted ship's crews could respond, the human warships that had fired were gone, jumped away to new positions before the return fire was even calculated. They reappeared a second later on a different bearing and fired again. The Sovereignty formation tried to consolidate. It could not. Every time a division pulled together, The human ships jumped into the gap that the pull created and hit from inside it. Every time a group of sovereignty ships locked targeting on a human vessel, that vessel was somewhere else before the lock completed. The orange sensor net fed real-time position data to every human bridge. The human fleet knew exactly where every sovereignty ship was at every moment. The sovereignty fleet knew only that their enemy kept disappearing and reappearing in places that should have been impossible. It was not a battle in the way the sovereignty understood battles. It was a lesson. The lesson took 4 hours. At the end of it, 640 sovereignty ships had disabled drives or disabled weapons or both. The remaining ships had pulled into a defensive cluster that was not attacking and not advancing. Fleet Admiral Sova sat on the bridge of his flagship, which had 3 disabled weapons arrays and a drive system running at 30%, and stared at the communication request that had just come in from Commander Voss. He accepted it. Alara's face appeared on his screen. She looked calm. She looked, if anything, tired in the way someone looks when they have finished a task that needed to be done rather than a fight they wanted to have. "Admiral," she said, "it's over. We are sending boarding teams to your disabled ships. They are Drath and they are large, but they will not harm your crews. Everyone will be treated well, given food and medical care if needed, and returned to the border under escort." She paused once. "I'd like you to tell the council what happened here. Not your version or our version, exactly what happened. Can you do that?" Sova looked at his disabled weapons display. He looked at the 400 human and allied ships now visible on his sensors, holding position and not pressing further. He looked at his crew, every one of them waiting for his answer. "Yes," he said, "I can do that." The aftermath took 2 weeks. Every sovereignty crew member was processed, documented, treated, fed, and released. Drath boarding teams were efficient and careful. Not a single sovereignty soldier was injured during boarding operations. Medical teams moved through the disabled ships offering treatment before it was asked for. When the last escort convoy crossed back over the rim boundary and the sovereignty ships disappeared into their own space, there was a quiet moment across the whole human fleet. Then someone on the Defiance bridge started clapping, and someone else joined in, and before long every crew member on the bridge was on their feet. Alara stood at the front and let it happen. She clapped with them for a moment. Then she held up one hand and the noise faded. "Clean up the debris field," she said, "and send a salvage team to collect anything useful the disabled ships left behind." She turned back to the navigation console. "We have work to do." In the Grand Conclave Hall, Senator Velkarath stood at the podium in front of the full chamber for the first time in his long career and said the things he had been building toward for 3 years. He laid out the full record, the exile, the settlement, the compact, the rejected diplomatic approach, and now the battle. He put Fleet Admiral Sova's report on the main screen, word for word, exactly as Sova had written it. He ended with one sentence: "We exiled them to break them. Instead, we gave them a kingdom." The hall was very quiet when he sat down. Across the galaxy, on 100 worlds and 1,000 stations, the footage of Alara's crew handing food packages to sovereignty soldiers they had just defeated moved through every communication network that existed. Strangers watched it on screens and shared it without words, because the image said something that words would have gotten in the way of. A fleet sent to destroy had been defeated, cared for, and sent home. The Outer Rim had done it, or rather, the people the galaxy had thrown away had done it. The difference was starting to matter very much. The galaxy does not change all at once. It changes the way a stone wall changes when water gets into the cracks, slowly, invisibly, and then all at the same moment when the pressure finally becomes more than the wall can hold. The pressure had been building for 3 years. The Battle of the Keth Expanse was the moment the wall came apart. Within 1 week of the battle's conclusion, 4 sovereignty member states sent private communications to Ashfall Station. Within 2 weeks, 8 more had followed. Some of them were small, fringe worlds with thin resources and long records of being overlooked by the Conclave's inner circle. A few were mid-tier states with enough economic weight that their interest carried real meaning. Every message was different in its wording. Every message said the same thing underneath the wording. We are watching what you built, and we want to know how to be part of it. Alara read every message herself. She assigned a response team and gave them clear instructions. Be honest about what the compact is, be honest about what it requires, and do not promise anything that cannot be delivered. She had spent years building something real, and she was not going to let the momentum of a military victory turn it into something hollow. Back in the Grand Conclave, High Counselor Draven Solus faced something he had never faced before. He was losing. Not in a fight. The fight was over, and he understood now that it had never been a fight he could win by force. He was losing the slower, quieter battle that actually determined who held power in a galaxy, the battle for relevance. When member states started looking outside the sovereignty for trade, security, and fair treatment, the sovereignty's claim to be the center of galactic civilization became a claim that required proof. The proof was no longer there in the way it used to be. Draven was old. He had served the sovereignty for longer than most species governments had existed. He had, in his long career, crushed rebellions, negotiated annexations, and outmaneuvered rivals who were cleverer than him by being more patient than them. He had sent humans to the outer rim to die and watched them build something instead. And now, he sat in his office at the top of the Conclave building and looked out at the city below and tried to decide if he was capable of doing the one thing his entire career had never required of him. He called Senator Velkarath into his office that evening. Velkarath came in and sat down without being asked. He was older than Draven by 4 decades and had the stillness of someone who had run out of things to be surprised by. He looked at Draven without speaking and waited. "What would they want?" Draven asked. He did not specify who he meant. He did not need to. Velkarath had already been in quiet contact with Ashfall through his own channels for months. He had been preparing for this conversation. He folded his hands and told Draven exactly what he had learned. They wanted open trade, no sovereignty fees, no exclusion clauses, no tariffs used as political tools. They wanted species rights codified into a galactic charter that all signatories were legally bound to honor, with an actual enforcement mechanism that did not rely on the goodwill of the most powerful party. They wanted the annexation policies that had displaced the Orin and a dozen similar species reversed, with those species given their territorial rights back or compensated appropriately. They wanted a new governance structure for the Galactic Charter, one with proportional representation, not a weighted system that put the sovereignty's inner circle permanently in control. They did not want to destroy the sovereignty. They wanted to reform it from outside it, by creating something better and making the sovereignty choose between joining or becoming irrelevant. Draven was quiet for a long time. That dismantles everything we built. It dismantles the parts of it that were never fair, Velkarath said. What was fair can stay, and it is better to dismantle it ourselves in a negotiation where we still have a seat at the table than to have it pulled apart by the weight of everyone walking away. Draven looked out the window again. The city below was lit up in the sovereignty's gold light. It was beautiful. He had always thought so. He thought so now. He also thought, for the first time, that beauty was not the same as justice, and that he had been using the first one to avoid looking clearly at the absence of the second. "Set up the meeting," he said. The negotiation did not happen in the Grand Conclave Hall. Alara had been clear about that from the first communication. The hall was built to make people feel small. She was not going to bring the Compact's representatives into a room designed to diminish them. The meeting would happen at Bastion Station, the large orbital hub that the humans and their allies had finished constructing 6 months earlier, in the outer rim, on neutral ground that happened to be inside Compact territory. The sovereignty's delegation arrived in a fleet of 7 diplomatic vessels. They were met at the Bastion approach corridor by a human escort that was polite, professional, and noticeably unhurried. The station itself was unlike any sovereignty structure. It was wide and practical, built from salvaged Keth materials and human engineering, with wide corridors and rooms that were sized to accommodate species of very different physical builds. Nothing about it was designed to impress. Everything about it was designed to work. The negotiation took 9 days. It was not easy. Some parts of it were very hard. The sovereignty's inner circle delegates pushed back on the annexation reversal provisions for 2 full days, because admitting that those policies had been wrong meant admitting something about their history that was deeply uncomfortable. The representation reform was fought over line by line. There were moments when delegations walked out of the room and had to be talked back in. Alara was patient throughout all of it. She did not perform patience. She was genuinely patient in the way that someone who has spent 3 years solving problems that should have killed her has learned to be patient. She let arguments run their course. She found the specific concern underneath each objection and addressed the concern directly rather than the surface argument. When delegates became heated, she stayed level. Not cold level. There is a difference. The Orin representative, an older woman named Sira who had been exiled from her home world 17 years ago and had been living on Rim stations ever since, cried when the annexation reversal article was finally accepted. She did not try to hide it. The room was quiet for a moment, and then the draft delegation, who did not express emotion through any visible physical response, pressed their hands against the wall simultaneously, which was, as Alara had learned over 3 years, what Drath did when something important had been done right. On the 9th day, the Galactic Compact of Free Worlds was ready to be signed. The ceremony was held in Bastion Station's main assembly hall, the largest room on the station, which was still not very large by sovereignty standards, so the delegates were seated close together, which Alara had decided was probably fine. The hall had been cleaned, and the lights were set to a warm tone, and someone had brought in plants from Ashfall City gray-green rim plants that did not look like the gold-leaf decorative species used in sovereignty ceremonies, but were alive and real, and had grown in the hardest soil in the known galaxy. Species after species came forward and signed. The Orin Collective signed first, because Alara had asked them if they wanted that honor and they had said yes. The Drath came next, pressing their stone-gray hands into the ink panels that had been prepared for them, leaving prints that looked like something between a signature and a foundation. The former Voakai representatives signed in the aggressive angular script of their raiding culture, looking slightly uncomfortable in the formal setting, and slightly proud in a way they were not quite admitting to. Then the smaller rim species, one after another, each of them representing people who had lived for years or decades in the dark of the outer rim, without anyone powerful enough to speak for them. Then the sovereignty's inner member delegates came forward. This took a while. Velkarath signed for the sovereignty as a whole in his steady, old-fashioned script and nodded once to Alara as he stepped back. Then the 12 sovereignty member states who had officially joined the compact signed their own separate acknowledgement documents, marking their dual membership, still within the sovereignty structure for now, but also bound by the new charter's terms. Alara signed last. She walked to the signing table and picked up the pen. It was a real pen, ink on paper, because she had always thought that the things that mattered most should be written in something that lasted. She signed her full name in the clear, even handwriting her mother had taught her when she was 7 years old. She put the pen down and looked up at the room. All of it. The Drath along the walls like quiet stone pillars. The Orin grouped together the way they always were, close enough to touch. The Voakai trying to look less moved than they were. The sovereignty delegates in their formal colors, some of them looking relieved, some of them looking like people in the middle of rethinking a great deal. The smaller species filling in the gaps, faces she had learned over 3 years of shared work and shared difficulty. She thought about the grand conclave hall, and the ceiling that formed clouds and the floor made from starstone, and the long, curved rows of delegates who had watched her leave with nothing. She thought about the Defiance Bridge and the star map and the gray zone at the edge of it. She thought about Calla running numbers at 6 in the morning, and Barrows with her hands covered in engine grease and Neem with his plate of gray fungal bread, and the orange ship broadcasting on an open channel in the middle of the dark. She thought about a child waving at a drone. Velkarath was watching her from across the hall. When she looked at him, he gave her a slow, deliberate nod, the formal reptilian gesture that meant, in his culture, something close to, "You did this right." She nodded back. In the conclave archives on the other side of the galaxy, a records clerk whose job was maintaining the official status files of all known political entities and civilizations pulled up the human record later that week to update it. It was a routine administrative task. The previous entry was simple. Under the heading for humanity's status, it read, Exiled Outer Rim. The clerk looked at the compact signing footage that had been playing on every network for 3 days. He looked at the green territory maps. He looked at the list of signatory species. He looked at the new galactic charter sitting in his update queue, officially submitted by all parties for archive registration. He deleted the old status line. He thought for a moment. Then he typed a single word and saved the file. The word was Founders. He closed the record and moved on to the next task. Outside the archive window, the conclave city went about its day, gold-lit and ancient, and for the first time in a very long time, not entirely sure it was still the most important place in the galaxy. Out in the outer rim, on a planet that had once been a dead rock in a radiation field, children played outside Ashfall City's surface structures under the light of old dim stars, under a shield tower sky that was just as safe as anywhere else in the known universe, which was something that had once been impossible and was now simply Tuesday. Above them, the rim hummed with ships and signals, and the low, steady pulse of a civilization that had been made from nothing by people who had been given nothing, and told they would amount to nothing. They had not listened. They never did.